science from Sharif University of Technology in Iran. Then he came to the US to do a PhD in physics in Brandeis. It was a PhD in physics, but he was specializing in computational neuroscience. So that was his, starting neuroscience. Then he did a couple of postdocs at Caltech with Christoph Koch. Then he did another one at Baylor with Reed Montag, as well as, and he also worked with Kim Moore at Stanford. And so Alireza is theoretical neuroscientist. He works on a lot of different things, like mostly decision making, adaptive decision making, and learning. So how do we, see uncertainty in the environment? How do we learn from it? He collaborates with a lot of different people and works on animal electrophysiology on one hand, but also collaborates with people who do human work with MEG and fMRI and psychophysics. So he does a lot of very interesting things, and we're super excited to have him with us. So Alireza, take it away.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for the nice introduction. Yes, as Dov mentioned, I have been doing a lot of stuff, and I'm very happy to be here and share with you some of the stuff that have been very interested in recently, and it's mostly focused on flexibility in learning and decision making. I mean, just from the title of my talk, you may wonder, yes, of course, decision making needs to be flexible in order to be successful, but learning is really about adjusting the behavior. So why learning itself needs to be flexible? And that is the main point of my talk, which is I want to argue that in the real world, both reward-based learning and decision-making need to be adjusted constantly. And hopefully I show some evidence for different types of adjustments and underlying neural mechanisms. So today, really, I will be talking mostly about some modeling work, some behavioral work in different species to make this point that this is almost true across a few mammalian species and what we can learn from it. So why this to be true? Why we need to be flexible in terms of learning and decision making? So what are these characteristics that basically make the real world make the flexibility an important requirement for learning and decision making? So one, as I said, is that the choice options have many features and attributes, so it's not clear how we should combine these features and attributes to make decisions. The other thing is that the reward feedbacks is scarce and non-specific. So you take many actions, and then you're followed with a very simple response, which is not specific to why your actions were successful or not, or the option you chose were rewarding or not. So this already makes learning and decision making very difficult in the real world and naturalistic settings. But on top of that, the real world is uncertain and volatile. And what I want to argue is that because of these characteristics and a few other things, these are just the most important one in my view. We need to use the information in the environment to determine how to combine and integrate information for making decisions. We need to decide what to learn from each feedback and how much to learn from each feedback. So my talk is really divided into three pieces, trying to answer these three questions. And in each part, I will answer one of them. And the first part is that how much to learn from each feedback. I mean, if you think about learning, even the simplest forms of life can learn from feedback. Even athlesia can learn from a shock. Now that makes it simple, but it's kind of obvious that you need to avoid things that are hurting you, and you need to approach things that are rewarding. But the real question is how much to learn from them. And what I want to show is that some evidence about how the amount of learning should be adjusted according to volatility in the reward environment. And volatility just loosely defined as how fast the reward environment is changing. So why should we actually learning be sensitive to volatility? Give you an example, a cartoon. So imagine you're choosing something, an option, and you give reward feedback. and here it's shown with the happy and sad faces. And in order to assign value, or basically figure out what it is the option you're choosing is good or not, you may try to do different things. For example, you can integrate feedback you get over time. Here I'm showing this flat line. Basically, you're just adding all your experience. And if you do that, you will see that, okay, this option you're choosing is 50% good, 50% bad. But this is not really the wisest thing you could do. You could actually put more weight on more recent reward outcome. And but the question is that how much you should how much weight you should put on more recent outcomes, or how you should integrate reward feedback over time. Now imagine you're in an environment. Again, the reward feedback shown with these golden and red circles. Gold means good, red means bad. It really doesn't matter. But as you can see, this reward environment is very volatile. Things become good and bad very quickly. In this environment, if you try to integrate past outcomes using this kernel, which basically tells you how much weight you should put on different options at different time, this is not a bad way of integrating. But maybe you should integrate on the shorter time scale and weigh more recent outcomes more strongly. But this comes at a cost. So the reason you can do that is because you can be more adaptive. You can integrate. You can change your behavior faster if the environment is changing. But your estimate of reward value or probability is less precise because you're relying on very few pieces of feedback. Now you can imagine you're in a different environment, and now the reward is more stable over a longer period of time, and in that case you want to integrate on a longer time scale, which gives you more precision because you are relying on more feedback. But this is more adaptable, less adaptable, because if the environment changes, you are not going to detect it very quickly as you are looking too far back in time. And so there is this trade-off. I will be talking about this kind of trade-off through my talk, but there's this trade-off between being adaptable and being precise, which I refer to the adaptability precision trade-off. I didn't invent this, and there are many different kinds of trade-off with similar notion, but I will use this to refer to the behavior that we are looking at. And so what it tells you is that you can be as precise as possible in estimating reward value, and at the same time being adaptable and flexible in changing your estimate. There is a trade-off there. How can we study this? People have been looking at a task like this, which is called probabilistic reversal learning task, for many, many years, but not necessarily looking at the effect of volatility, which you can do very easily. It mostly was used for learning, studying learning, because it requires continuous learning. So the task is very simple. The animal or human choosing between two options, here shown with green and purple, and choose one of them and get reward feedback. What is special about this task is that the reward probabilities are stochastic, probabilistic. So for some amount of time, let's say for the first 20 trials, the reward probability on the red option is 80%, and for the green option is 20%. And after 20 trials, it reverses. So now the green is a better option, and so on. So every 20 trials, in this case, the good and bad options switch. And you can control volatility of the environment by this block length. The idea that people have been playing with, thinking about how you learn in this environment, you can capture it with the simple reinforcement learning model. Here, you can basically assign a value to the green option, V of G, and then update it every time you get reward feedback using a simple reward prediction error, which is 1 minus VG if you get rewarded, or minus VG if you don't, times the learning rate, which is shown with alpha plus here for rewarded trials. And you can use a different learning rate for unrewarded trials. And again, when people think about these things, they say, okay, this is basically how we are looking at this question, and we are going to fit the behavior with different models. This is one possible model, and extract learning rate. And the assumption was that if you are in the or intuition, I should say. It's very also similar to the cartoon I showed at the beginning. So when you are in a more volatile environment, you can imagine the learning rate should go up because you want to learn faster. And if you're in a more stable environment, you can decrease your learning rate. Is there any evidence for this? So there is this influential paper by Tim Burns and colleagues in 2007 that many people refer to as the ultimate answer for this question, in which they show that the learning rate goes up actually in volatile environment and is lower in a stable environment. This is in human. And then we replicated this experiment. Actually, Dale Lee's lab replicated this experiment in monkeys, and they found basically no difference between the learning rate in the volatile and stable environment. And we did basically Burns' experiment in our lab, and you don't see any difference again in humans or again monkeys. So even though it looks very intuitive that, okay, if the environment is more volatile, you just learn faster because that helps you to catch up with what is going on, this doesn't seem to be true all the time. So there is not conclusive evidence for that. Now, so we asked the question of how actually we can adjust learning, and is this adjustment is all about the learning rate. So there are many models out there in terms of how you can adjust learning rate. When you think about learning, the next question is that how much you learn. There are some normative model trying to say basically what we should do it, what is the optimal way to adjust our learning rate. And if you're interested, we review that in this paper, all these different types of models. But the main issue with all these models is that they're trying to account for the changes in the learning rate, for which really there is no conclusive evidence. And also in some of these models, especially in the Bayesian normative model, it's not clear how high-level computations that are assumed there are implemented by neural mechanisms and brain circuits. Again, most of these models are hierarchical, assuming there's a level on top of the learning process itself that inform how much learning should be done. But the computation for them are very difficult to implement in the brain. So we asked the question, first of all, seeing these results that are not clear whether the learning goes up or down or even doesn't change. As you can see, the result I show you, you can say, yes, for some subjects go up, for some goes down, and we don't know when it happens. Or you can say there is no real concrete changes. But we wanted to see whether you actually need something very high level to figure out and adjust learning in this situation. And so we came with a mechanistic model for adjustment of learning to uncertainty and volatility in the environment. And the model is rather simple, straightforward, I would say. So you have sensory neurons representing whether certain options are available, and then they project to what we call these value encoding neurons that are going to estimate or learn the value of red and green option. And they in turn project to decision-making circuit that in this case uses a winner-take-all or competitive process to make a decision. And every time you get feedback after making decisions, then you're updating the values. The values are assumed to be stored in the synapses projecting to value encoding neurons. The idea is very simple, is that basically if the synapses are stronger, if they have, if they're stronger, you cause more postsynaptic activity and higher firing rates, and as a result, you present higher value and influence choice more strongly. So what we did, we assumed that in this model, which we call reward-dependent metaplasticity model, we assumed that these synapses that are learning or estimating the value of different options are metaplastic. So they are just more than being plastic, and I tell you what they are exactly, but there's a big literature out there about metaplasticity and have been used to answer different questions. So we try to use the same ideas here to see whether they can explain the behavior. So what we have is that this metaplastic model of synapses have two levels of synaptic efficacy, which you call weak and strong, shown with W and S, different colors. And each one has multiple metastates. So all these, let's say this green metastate, which we have there, we call them weak, have basically the same efficacy, but they have different levels of stability in terms of how they are going to change to another state. The same thing with the strong synapses. How it works is that we assume like if there is a potentiation event, this weak metastate become more unstable by moving upward in these states, and also some of them become actually strong. And the strong metastate actually transition to more stable state. So again, there is a movement for weaker synapses to become more unstable and strong synapses to be stable when there is potentiation. The same thing in opposite direction happen when there is when there is depression event, and so strong synapses become more unstable. Some of them transition to the most unstable weak state, and weak states become more stable. So this is basically the entire model and the architecture, basically, in terms of how the learning is happening. So even though the architecture is simple, it's difficult to trace what happened because there are these states that are making things complicated, and there are many transition probabilities here shown with these P and Q values. So the assumption here is that the more stable state have a smaller transition probability, and you can use different equation to quantify that, but that really doesn't matter. The main idea here is that you have this meta states, or these hidden states that have the same efficacy. So to the external world, they're doing exactly the same thing, but different, depending on their stability, they are changing differently when a potentiation depression event happens. Okay, so let's look at the behavior of this model in this probabilistic reversal learning task. So the task, as I mentioned, is very simple. Let's say for 80 trials, the green target is a better option, and then after that, the red target becomes the better option, and they are rewarding, let's say, with 80% probability. So what happens that if you look at where the synapses go, if you are in the environment when green is more rewarding, and the synapses, let's say, code for the value of the green target, they basically become more stable. They go to transition from weak state to strong state, and this is the fraction of synapses in different strong states. And you can see as more time passes, they move more to S4, which is the most stable strong state. And you can see what happens to the weak states. So they become empty because there's a transition upward and to the right and down there. So most of the weak synapses in W2, 3, and 4. Most of them are in the strong metastate. Now, what happened when the environment is more volatile, which is when, let's say, every 20 trials the reward probabilities switch. Again, this is quite arbitrary, what I call volatile and stable, but this is just for referring to this environment. So now, if the environment changes more frequently, you can see that the synapses don't actually find enough time to go to the deepest strong states, and so basically you will get different distributions of synapses at different places. And that would determine how the model respond when the reversals happen, when the reward probability switch. So because this model has many transition probabilities, and you can see you have to track 8 different metastates, like how synapses are distributed there, you can actually make your life easier by coming up with an effective learning rate for this. It also helps you to compare with the reinforcement learning model. So what you do, basically, you assume what would be the behavior of this model. So in the top, I show the fraction of synapses in different metastates, and at the bottom, I show the effective learning rate, which would be what would be the effective learning rate if you assume you only have transition between weak and strong state. Now, here I assume that the reward is assigned to the better option, and what you can see, effective learning rates on those events is going up after reversals. And You can do the same thing for calculate the effective learning rate when the reward is assigned on the worst option. Remember, the better option is rewarding 80% of the time, and the worst option is rewarded 20% of the time. So both of them are possible. So what happens now is that the effective learning rate goes down. So as you can see, if you put them together, you can see that the effective learning rate, depending on the outcome, which in this simple task, because the reward is anti-correlated, so it's either on the good or bad option. For one of them goes up for the better option, for the worst option goes down, which basically means that the system becomes more sensitive to outcomes that are supporting what the past history has been telling, and become less sensitive to the events that are in the opposite direction. Now we can look at the volatile environment, and you see the same thing happens, but the learning rate, or sorry, the effective learning rate don't go to the same values that we saw before. They start closer to each other. There's a crossover, and then they end not so different from each other. This is a very simple prediction of this model, and you can get it almost with any parameters you put in this model. But the important thing is that this model does not predict an overall increase or decrease in the learning rate, but it says that actually there is an increase in the effective learning rate or decrease depending on which option you're looking at. Is it supporting the better option or worse option? And again, this task only has two options. If you think about having many options in a task that you have multiple options, you can see that learning rate becomes specific, option specific, and history dependent. And that could explain what we saw before, which is inconsistent result by the change in the learning rate. Because this model really doesn't say, because this crossover, if you average over different possible outcomes, you would see very small difference or no difference in terms of the learning rate, because it actually tells you cannot be blind to what option you're looking at. You need to consider that, and then you will see this specific change over time. Is there any evidence for this? So it should be, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. But so there's data from David Lee's lab at Johns Hopkins. They basically look at this probabilistic reversal learning task, and it's in monkeys, and so we have thousands of trials that we could use to estimate this effective learning rate. So as you see in the bottom panels, this is the estimated learning rate from monkey's choice behavior, and it's quite close to what we see in terms of model prediction. Again, it doesn't need to be matched exactly, because you can say it's a specific set of parameters, but the point is that the effective learning rate change over time in a specific way, and that's confirmed by the experimental data in monkeys. Again, we only could do this because there's so much data. You can't really do this with human data. Okay, so and another thing is that this model predicts choice behavior better than competing model. Here, and we tested many models. First, because of our OCD, and also because nice reviewers who didn't believe us. So especially the Bayesian models, we tested a Bayesian model of Behrens et al. And another Bayesian model, and they are not doing well in this task. And so in both stable and volatile environment, our model predicts choice behavior better. And this is cross-validated, so it's considered the number of it takes into account the number of parameters in each model. So one thing that I want to mention that is interesting is that because of this, the way that this model adjusts its behavior, again, it doesn't know anything about the environment. It just perceives the reward, receives the reward feedback, and it adjusts its transitions. Is that it predicts that the model becomes slower in response to reversals compared to RL models or normative models. And we can actually see the reflection of that in the choice behavior of the monkey. So this is looking at the quality of fit with the log likelihood right after reversals. And as you can see, the what I refer to as RDMP, reward dependent metaplasticity, it captures the behavior better right after reversals. It shows that the monkeys are following this thing, so they become slower in responding to reversals. So in a way, the model is trying to actually discriminate better between the good and bad option, while becoming more insensitive to changes in the reward environment. And that is it's a very interesting connections to some of the work that Garrett Stanley has done at Georgia Tech, looking at the effect of neural adaptation and the fact that it can enhance discrimination at the expense of detection. So I hope it's clear there is a very similar process here, that this metaplastic system is adjusting or adapting to the environment, and as a result of that, it can actually discriminate better between the good and bad option, but it can detect reversals because you can't do both at the same time. There is a trade-off as well. So I thought this link is very interesting. So just to conclude here, the first part of my talk, I hope that I show that reward-dependent metaplasticity provides a mechanism for continuous adjustments of learning without any underlying optimization or knowledge of the environment. And it predicts that the learning rates are time-dependent and the stimulus or action is specific. So there is no single set of learning rate that applies to all sort of learning for all options, etc. And it is a very different view of looking at the models and why we learn differently, let's say, about different options. Because again, there is no single learning rate. And so that also predicts or explains why there is no significant change in the overall learning rate according to volatility of the environment, which could explain the inconsistent results on the effect of learning rate, the effect of volatility on the learning. So I'm not doing so bad, but not so great. I could stop here and answer some questions, or I keep going before moving to the next question. Next point.
You can keep going.
Should I continue?
Hmm?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead and continue.
Okay. So going back to the main point of my talk, now let's look at the question of, as I said, the real world options have many attributes or features. So the question is how we should combine and integrate information for making decisions. And the specific things that whether the strategy for combining reward information depends on uncertainty in the environment. So this, I just give you a quick introduction just to make sure people are on the same page. It's sort of simple stuff you already know. But when people think about valuation of risky options, so let's say you have a gamble that gives you magnitude M1 with probability P1, magnitude M2 with probability P2, etc. How would you evaluate that? And the simple answer, mathematical answer, is that you should calculate the expected value, EV, which is just the product of the magnitude and probability. And that's what you should do. But nobody does that. And this is known for the past 200 years that the expected value is not what drives behavior. So people came with expected utility theory, in which the magnitude is replaced with a function of magnitude. So it basically tells you reward outcomes have a utility, and that is subject specific. So you replace M with a function of M, but still you multiply that probability. 50 years ago, it turned out that that doesn't work either. And so prospect theory came and said that actually everything is subjective, magnitude and probability. So you multiply a function of magnitude and a function of probability, which is called probability weighting function. And that's how you confirm subjective value. And again, it depends on different subjects and so on. But no matter what, you go from between different models, you always multiply the function of magnitude and the probability. But another alternative you could do is that you could combine these two pieces by summing them with different weights. So you could think that you actually use the utility of a certain outcome and you add the probability of certain outcome to come up with subjective value, or actually may not even come up with a subjective value and use this way of weighting them to compare options. I will get to it quickly, but in a second. But So instead of multiplying these two, which is a correct thing mathematically, you want to add them. And again, adding them sounds very stupid because you're comparing apples and oranges. Magnitude and probability have different units. They can be on very different scales. And so how would you actually add them? But if you think in terms of brain, that's what brain does all the time, always combine things that have no relevance in terms of units. So what an additive model would gives you. And it's very funny. If you look at hundreds or thousands of papers on choice on the risk, people fight over what should be the function that is multiplied to give you subjective value. But very few papers actually test whether you may actually not multiply these two functions and you add them. Anyway, what does an additive model would give you? It's very simple. It's related to what I was saying. If the environment is volatile and you need to have combined probability and magnitude, an additive model would allow you actually to put less weight on the probability because it's uncertain, because it changes all the time, and put more weight on the magnitude. And if the environment is stable, you can actually put more weight on the probability than magnitude. And that basically gives you flexibility to deal with uncertainty in the environment. So we ask whether the moving or transition between using an additive and a multiplicative model, it actually depends on the uncertainty in the environment. And we tested it, or we assumed that under risk, when the reward information is given, so there is no uncertainty in terms of the change in the, even though there is some sort of uncertainty, expected uncertainty here, because the outcomes are probabilistic, people use a multiplicative model. And under uncertainty, when the reward probabilities are unknown and have to be learned, then they use an additive model. And that's basically what we wanted to test, whether this is the case. So we look at two different tasks. This is a cross-species study. This is data from Ben Hayden's lab at the University of Minnesota. The monkey is provided with two gambles, and the gambles are shown with two bars that have different colors. The color would tell them how much reward they get. So if, let's say, they choose the left option, which has green and red, if they get the green part, they get medium reward, certain amount of juice. If they get the red part, it means get nothing. And so the monkey know what each color means. They have been trained, and the size of each part will tell them what is the probability of getting certain outcomes. And I can assure you, we have done all sort of analysis to make sure to completely understand they're sensitive to both pieces of information. We basically replicated the same experiment in humans. We just replaced the drop of juice with the points that would turn into monetary reward. But otherwise, it's very similar. And because we wanted to actually be able to compare them as closely as possible. So this is a gambling task. We look at choice on the risk, and then we use the probabilistic reversal learning task, the same task that I explained earlier, but I didn't explain all the details of it, which is now the animals choose between two options. This is the red and the green option, and there are these dots around each option which tell them how much reward they may get with the probability that they have to learn. So if let's say the red is 80% or 20% rewarding, which again has to be learned by the animal, they may get 3 drops of juice with that probability. And if they choose the green option, they may get reward 1 drop of juice with probability that is again has to be learned. So basically this task is very straightforward. It's a gambling task in which the probability of reward has to be learned. And you can have different versions of it where the reward probability changes frequently or infrequently or not at all. So you could have a completely stable environment where the reward probabilities are fixed, but they are not given, and the animal has to learn it. We did, again, the same experiment in humans, but again, replaced the number of dots with numbers. And I'll just jump over this detail because it's not important. What we found is that now comparing these two tasks, when you look at the gambling task where we look at choice under risk, most this is in monkeys. In most sessions, the animal are choosing a hybrid model, which is a mixture of multiplicative and additive model, or multiplicative model most of the time. So when I say hybrid model, is the together with the multiplicative model can explain most of the sessions basically, because the beta multiplicative is the weight of the multiplicative model on the choice behavior. So as you can see, most of the time, a multiplicative component is dominating the behavior. Now, the same monkeys, sorry, not the same monkeys, different monkeys. Now they're doing this mixed learning task or probabilistic reversal learning task, and now you see the parent completely switches toward a hybrid model, which is dominated by an additive model because the beta multiplicative is very small now. So now you can see the shift in the strategy in monkeys data. This is for human data. You get basically the same shift. It's slightly weaker in humans than monkeys. This is cross subjects. In monkeys, it's cross sessions. But what you can see is that the multiplicative model can explain the choice behavior under risk, or has a stronger influence on choice behavior under risk, while an additive model provides better fit for choice under uncertainty. So this result is interesting because what is not clear, what they mention is that an additive model, even though I call it an additive model for construction of value, what it really means is that the animal could just compare probability of the two options and compare the magnitude of the two options and then combine their comparison to make a choice. So there's no need actually to come up with subjective value in this case, which is completely which is basically undermining the most important concept in neuroeconomics. And it happens under uncertainty. We have evidence that it happens in most cases. So actually, a multiplicative model for a construction subjective value is rare. Now, if you remember, the premise of this additive model was that it's more flexible. So what you can do, you can see actually whether the weight of magnitude to probability between a stable and volatile environment or less volatile and more volatile environment is different. And as you can see, it is. So when you increase volatility, the weight of magnitude to probability increases because the probability is not reliable. And so the animals, both monkeys and humans, rely more on the magnitude which is given and is certain than the probability. So you can see that what I claimed earlier, that the additive model allows flexibility because you can adjust how much weight you put on different pieces of information is actually true behaviorally. And also you can see the reflection of that in how neurons in prefrontal cortex encoding reward information. So we're looking at neurons that are encoding the difference in magnitude of the two options on the screen. And if you look how strongly they're responding to difference in magnitude, that is correlated with how strongly the monkey weight magnitude or probability in a given session of the experiment. So there's a correlation here, which is shown in panel F. It's not true for neurons that are encoding the sum of the reward magnitude, and it shouldn't, because again, these are the neurons we think that they are helping decision making. So there's a reflection of what we see in the behavior as well. Okay, look at my watch to see how I'm doing with time. I'm not doing well. Okay, so let me see. So here also you can compare all different things, the learning rate on rewarded, unrewarded trial, and other strategies, and there is no difference between the more and less volatile environment. So volatility does not have any effect on this. Again, this is in monkeys. You could think that it happens in other places as well. So here is data from Jeremiah Cohen's at Johns Hopkins, looking at the choice behavior of mice, leaking left and right and getting rewards. And if you can estimate reward probability, their learning rate in the more and less volatile environment, the definition of less and more volatile is not the same as before, but you can forgive me for that. But the idea is that what you see if you estimate learning rate in this task, you can actually see that volatility slightly increases the learning rate for rewarded trial, but it actually decreases the learning rate on unrewarded trial. And that is an interesting observation. Again, added nuances to what types of adjustment one would see in terms of volatility. And similar thing happened when you think about how predictable or unpredictable the environment is, which I'm going to skip because I want to get to the more important thing. So I hope in the second part of my talk, I showed that on the risk, humans and monkeys use a multiplicative model for combining reward information, which could correspond to integration of reward into subjective value. But under uncertainty, that goes away, and now you have basically a model which is additive, which means that the animals are comparing attributes and not fusing information to come up with one single subjective value. And it helps to be more flexible. So from here also you can see that there is a trade-off being between a flexible or precise model for evaluation. And again, here I'm using flexibility in a more, flexibility is clear, but precision here, you can say mathematical precision. It's what would drive a model based on a multiplication of probability and likelihood. So I have 5 minutes, yes? And I can just mention what I wanted to say in the last part of my talk, which is the question of what to learn. And the idea is that if you think about you are eating an apple and it's crispy and it's red and I don't know, it's big, and you get a good experience, what you want to learn, you could say that you're learning about the texture, about the color of this apple, or you're actually learning about this specific type of apple based on reward feedback. So these two I refer to as, you could do object-based learning. You're learning something about the object itself, or you're learning about its features. And the main argument is that, which I, again, won't go into it, is that if you want to learn about objects, there are many things to learn about. So it's a huge dimensionality reduction if you learn about the features of an object when you get feedback. But because it allows you faster learning as well, because if you update your value about an object, only you can update it when you see that object, but you can update many features every time you receive feedback on an object. So it gives you much faster learning, but the world is not constructed such that the features of an object would predict their value. There are a lot of inconsistency. Not all the red crunchy things are good, yes? So that basically causes you to move toward object-based learning. So there is what I want to say, there is a trade-off between what you can learn about objects or about the features of an object. And we tested this trade-off in a few experiments. So I don't have time to go through. But what we show, if I can just shamelessly go to here, is that all these factors I show you actually drive the behavior one way or the other. You can read about this in a paper we published, so it's not really important. But volatility of the environment will push you toward feature-based learning. So if the environment changes more frequently, you pick feature-based learning. But if the environment is not generalizable, you go back to object-based learning. And if the environment has higher dimension, you go to feature-based learning because, again, it allows you to learn faster. And now, again, you can see there's a trade-off between a flexible model versus precise model for learning from reward feedback. So the more interesting stuff here is that, again, you can read about those stuff in my paper we published in 2017. But the more interesting things are what happened between object-based learning and feature-based learning. So what I mean here, feature is like individual features. You learn about the color or shape or something, versus object-based learning, where you learn about each object itself. So you can imagine there's something between the two, and what could be between the two is learning about the conjunctions of features. So this sounds, I mean, I use terms from visual uh, field of vision because I have some background there because of my many postdocs, but it should make sense to other people as well that what we could learn something between the two. And that is something I think very important because what we know mostly about the representation of reward is limited to very one-dimensional things. You reward the animal on a green or red button, and then you want to see how the reward value is represented in the brain. So you can have now more complex tasks where you have here in this case 3 features, shape, pattern, and color, and the subject choose between them and get reward feedback. And now with a specific reward schedule, so this is the reward probability assigned to different options, you can actually study how humans learn about different features. And what we find is that, if I go quickly to this part, is that you can look at the choice behavior by feeding choice behavior, look at the goodness of fit over time, or you can look at the estimates that the subject give over time. But what you observe is that they start learning about individual features very quickly, as you can see by the weight of this on their estimate and in the right panel. And then slowly start learning about the informative conjunctions. So it's much slower learning about informative conjunctions for 2 reasons. Perhaps one is that they see those conjunctions less often than features, but also it could be other mechanisms such as attention involved in this, so that makes the learning faster or slower. So, and just maybe 1 more minute about this is that you can actually capture this behavior with a recurrent neural network, because I mean we do different kind of modeling, but it seems that this would be suitable here instead of models that you built from scratch, because again it's not clear how different representations are actually formed over time. So again, if you are you're choosing something, you get reward feedback, it's not clear whether we actually have a representation for certain features in our value system, or we don't, or do we have any certain representation for conjunctions of features or not. We know that we have all those things when we come by visual processing, but there's a main difference there, which is for learning about all those important information about the visual world, you just need to open your eyes and you get feedback constantly. You can understand the statistics of all sort of connections in the world just by observing it. But when it comes to the reward environment, you don't get enough feedback, and that's really the main difference there. So to go to my conclusion here, you can actually capture these things and you can look at the representation, this recurrent unit, and try to relate that to something that is probably important and interesting for some of people here. Ouch. Let me go back here. A really horrible thing here. So if you look at the recurrent units, you could have, in this case, you could have 8 different types of units that they could have plasticity in their recurrent excitation or inhibition or their input to these units. And these units actually have different representation in terms of this learning strategy. And that is very exciting. So this is something that we are exploring now. I should say my former student, Shiva, is exploring. And it seems to give us very nice predictions in terms of how different subtypes of neurons actually could contribute to the representation of value in the brain. So with that, I hope that I kind of convinced you that certain characteristics of the real world require flexibility and continuous adjustments of learning and decision making in terms of how to combine and integrate information, how to learn from reward feedback, what to learn from reward feedback, and how much to learn from reward feedback. And there's always a trade-off between being flexible and precise in terms of the strategy for combining reward information. So the strategy I mentioned was whether you fuse the information, reward probability and magnitude into subjective value versus you compare them. The learning model, I didn't get to talk about it too much, but it's the idea of what we learn from after choosing an option and getting feedback. Are we learning something specific about that object, or about these features or conjunctions of features? And about the amount of update in the estimation of reward value that I mentioned earlier, that maybe we have a different way of updating them. But in all cases, it seems that flexibility is more important. Because if you are precise, which means that you're trying to get more reward or optimize the amount of reward you get, the environment changes drastically, you'll be dead. So it's not as important to get 1% more of juice or fruit or whatever versus being alive. And that's really what is driving me this day, thinking about the trade-off between flexibility and precision. So before I forget to acknowledge all my collaborators, actually I should acknowledge Shiva, my graduate student, who is now in the job market. She's doing a postdoc. She did, as you probably saw her name on all the studies I mentioned. She is amazing. And my collaborators, Dale Lee, Ben Hayden, Jamal Cohen, and Alicia Escudero, without whom we couldn't say so much with just human experiment. So, and thank you for your attention. Sorry, I went 5 minutes over my time.
Thank you, Reza. So let me open this for questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much for that provocative presentation. We have a lot to talk about later, I think. If I understood that, one of the things that you were saying in the first part of your talk was that when you introduced the volatility in the reward, it seems to be the case that the learning rate that we usually lump together lots of things and refer to one learning rate is actually something much more complicated than that. It's maybe there are multiple learning rates, and it's very dependent upon the task and so on. I mean, did I get that right?
Yes,
that
that's
really
correct. Yeah.
layers to this, and that you can enhance learning rate in sort of one sense, but diminish in another sense, and maybe we would interpret that as no change at all.
Exactly, that's correct. Yes, and it's and the other thing is that it doesn't have to be the same. If you have this adaptive system, they are different for different options, probably for different domains, etc., depending on what you clump together. Because probably there is some clumping in the brain in connecting things. But yes, they are different for different options, and they are different with respect to reward feedback. So if the reward feedback is confirming what has been going on in the environment, you get something versus something else if they are not confirming that. So clumping together them into one learning rate is the biggest mistake, because you lose all the important information about how the system is adjusting by doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And maybe just a quick follow-up to that. I'm wondering, always in these kind of behavioral experiments, when you start playing around with the reward probabilities and so on, I'm wondering to what extent the subject is aware. I'm imagining myself playing this game and at times thinking like, wait, I know I was correct in that, but yet I got no reward, versus other times I might blame myself for getting it incorrect. So this is something we might not be able to determine from an animal study, but I'm wondering if you have any insights about like what the perspective of the individual is and what impact that would have on their on the impact. Yeah.
I wish I knew that question. I don't know, because even for human experiments, which we do in my lab, I strongly believe that human subjects are able to produce a lot of bullshit when you ask them what they did. So that's why I simply don't ask them about their strategy, what they do, because again, we grew up to do that. From childhood we have to come up with an explanation for our choices. So we are very good at that. And I don't think it's really related to what we do. I don't think we have access to that at the conscious level. So I don't know the answer, like whether the subjects know what they are doing or they're upset. Some people have done few experiments with probabilistic reversal learning and looking at how people feel and stuff like that. I can tell you later, but we
Okay,
didn't do
thanks.
that. Yeah.
Dobby, it sounds like estimating confidence might be a way to get insight into what Garrett was just asking about, right? You asked the subject to estimate how confident they were on the choice.
Yes.
Reza, that was a great talk. I had a question related to kind of your thoughts on what are the benefits potentially of having a simpler additive model in terms of implementation at the neural level, right? Because to first approximation, neurons add and subtract, right? And
yes,
implementing these kind of more complicated multiplicative models can be problematic in a simple sort of network model. So I was wondering what your insight about that would be for how this simplifies, quote, the problem of the environment.
The computational problem. So there are two issues with the multiplicative model. Again, multiplicative model is a very simple version of whether we combine all the information to come up with one number. I mean, it looks very elegant, subjective value, yes? And that's why people love it. You just come up with one number for all the garbage you have to deal with, and you come up for another option, you come up with a number, and you compare the number. And that's like beautiful. Yes, you can make decision over anything you want. So first of all, that requires a lot of wiring that need to be tuned so that if all these areas encoding this piece of information, this piece of information, this piece, going to the place that the subjective value is computed requires a lot of wiring and also requires a lot of tuning that they are not off, because if they're off, it's over. Yes, you can't just suddenly change your connection, make it weaker or stronger. But if you are doing comparisons, which is the point of additive models, as you know better than anybody, inhibition is really the main thing. You just compare. You can do it within an area. You compare and you know which is better in terms of this specific aspects, attribute. Another area can do it for another thing, another area. And all you need to do now, decide which of these you should listen to. And which one you should listen to should actually not be determined by any normative model, but by your state. Like you're hungry, you ignore everything, you just look at the magnitude. If you are like in different state, you just listen to that system more strongly. And that's why, I mean, if you look at every valuation system, you see all this connection between this area, which tells you they have access to control, let's say, choice. But that's basically telling you that maybe the comparison is done there within an attribute. You compare things that are relevant, let's say probability, magnitude, other things, and then you combine them. So it's in terms of that, it's more flexibility in terms of how the animal or the brain can choose what information to listen to without trying to come up with a way of converging everything to one place and then using that elegant story, which is, to me, that's completely wrong, because that just, but it's very difficult to tease them apart. So here I show some example because we had so much data and we really zoom into that, and we could actually tease apart what they are doing. But yeah, there are a lot of interesting things, again, because you are working on the circuit level. There are a lot of interesting things in terms of what this computation imply in terms of inhibition competition between circuit, these two types of computation. And I think, yeah, there are a lot of interesting things we can talk about if you're interested. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Sorry, I didn't leave so much time for questions by going over time.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about optimality, but I wonder whether we should just leave it for our conversation later.
Yeah, I mean, sure. If you want to inform other people about optimality, you can ask them the question. I can help.
Yeah, I think maybe it's more polite to take it offline if people have to go to the timetable at 12:15.
Yes, exactly.
All right, well, great. Then thank you again for this wonderful presentation. That was really nice. And yeah, I think a few of us are going to have the treat to talk to you later one-on-one.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't know how to end these things, but thank you for presenting.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to my conversation with you and a few other people. I hope I made the point that I wanted to make about the flexibility. Yes, thank you very much.